competition and mutualism and other interactions of larger organisms in aquatic environments. So this is a system that Keith Giddo has put together out on Kanza. Some of you may have shoveled rocks out there. Have any of you done that? Yeah, so Trevor can tell you about shoveling these rocks. It's not easy. Essentially, these are just experimental systems to try to simplify things to the point where you can do these experiments where you look at interactions among species. Facilitations, other species interactions, and start into complex community interactions, but then we'll get into succession and disturbance in a bigger sense in the next chapter after this. One of the things that's really difficult with competition, and this was something that came around in the 70s, was sort of a hot topic in ecology, and ever since then, if you posit that competition is an important structuring factor in communities, you really have to prove that there's competition going on. And this really kind of comes from a view that originated with Darwin, in that evolution is essentially acting on these organisms that are competing with each other for resources, or organisms that are being eaten or trying not to be eaten and trying to eat other organisms. And so historically it was just like, oh, that must be that way because of competition. I see this one here and this one there, must be that way because of competition. But it turns out when you go out and you do experiments in the field to really prove that competition is existing, it's quite difficult to actually show that that's the case, and oftentimes there's really not competition going on. And part of the reason for that is what is referred to as the ghost of competition past, and the idea that organisms should evolve away from competing with each other, right? And so does anybody know what the general term for this, if they've evolved away from competing with each other, and what they're evolving to do, what they're partitioning? General idea. What is the sum total of all the habitat that an organism has, including space and food and everything else? Do you remember the term for that?
Niche partitioning.
Niche partitioning, good, right. So essentially what you'd expect an organism to do is evolve towards partitioning niches out, right, and not competing with another one. And that's the whole basis for the Darwin's finches thing. But a lot of ecology that's gone on since then. However, if you go back to that community and you test for competition at that point, you're actually not going to be able to detect it because they've evolved away from competing with each other directly. So that's part of the reason that it's a difficult thing to show. Maybe we're getting to the point now where we can actually talk about things like the genes that allow for these different behaviors, and we can talk about different gene frequencies and what might have been the selective pressure on those genes that led to this, and come up with mechanisms like that. And that's probably part of the frontier of evolutionary ecology and competition. So there's also this thing about bottom-up control we talked about, and light. So we've been referring to this idea of control of competition for light when we talk about things like why cyanobacteria are dominant, how cyanobacteria partition the light environment out by having phycobilins that can harvest energy and they can be deep down in a lake below. The algae, the eukaryotic algae, which have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B that take out the blue and the red, and they can use the green light down deep, so that's a niche partitioning. Bottom-up competition, we've talked about that explicitly when we talked about Tillman's work, where you have the two different Monod equations, the growth versus concentration for nutrients, and two different nutrients, and how you can have coexistence or one or the other wins. It's a very specific competition. And then in addition, we've also mentioned a little bit about how benthic organisms compete for space. So if we talked about succession here, and one of the things that we talked about is, as these microbes developed, is that they would be competing more for nutrients and for light. But essentially, this is really a competition for space, right? Because there's only so much space a benthic organism can be in. So it's fairly clear that in wetland plant communities, there's a good bit of competition for space. And that can be, it can be important. And the reason for that is there's lots of life, there's lots of water, there's oftentimes lots of nutrients in wetlands, although not all wetlands. Some wetlands are fairly nutrient poor, and they can be highly productive. So it means that there's a lot of competition to get a hold in those systems. So a lot of wetland plant studies have to do with competition and assembly rules. And that gets back to the idea that actually Lisa asked the question about when you restore a wetland, do you come in and plant stuff, or do you let stuff come in? And part of the problem with when you plant stuff, if you don't plant things that can compete well with each other, then it's just a waste of money to put them in, because the competition is so intense, they'll just be knocked right out of the system. So it goes back to practical applications as well. Next partition. Yeah.
Could you make the argument that in evolutionary history that there initially was competition and that's what led to niche partitioning?
Yes, that's exactly the argument. That's what the ghost of competition past is.
Okay.
So it could have been important, but it's very difficult to establish experimentally in the field at this time. Exactly. So competition can be interspecific or intraspecific, right? Between species or within a species. And then you can think of all the different ways that species can compete with themselves within a species. And this might be competition for space, competition for mates, competition for resources, all those kinds of things. And so we just have an example here of some tadpoles that were grown in different containers and the growth rates. And what happens is if you bring up the density to high rates, the growth rate of each individual gets low because food becomes limiting. We see a similar thing when we talk about fisheries, and that is you get a problem with fisheries if you have a lot of small fish. And can anybody tell me about that? I'm going to tell Keith on you if you don't give me the answer here pretty quick.
You've got a lot of small fish that none of them can get bigger because your resources are limiting and space is limiting.
Right, they essentially compete with each other, and you can get a situation where you've got a whole bunch of fish that stack up in these smaller size classes. None of them are able to grow enough to get into the size that people want to catch, right? So in fisheries management, what do you do when you have that situation?
Slot limit.
You do a slot limit, you let people catch as many small fish as they want. Maybe you even just physically remove smaller fish, to knock the numbers down, right? And this is all related to the idea of intraspecific competition. And then you can imagine this having some evolutionary consequences. So for example, we have fishes that have some fairly spectacular displays. So we have here is a stone roller, and they get these the males get these big tubercles on them, and they fight each other for territory, and they make nests. They roll stones or stone rollers, right? And they're competing for these sexy little female fish. And this is obviously has an evolutionary cost to it, and sexual selection that has led through intraspecific competition has led to these kinds of things. Many of the really bright displays that you see fishes that have, some of the darters, for example, are quite spectacular. Probably maybe the eye spots on sunfish, but those might be a predation thing too. They might be a fake eye, so it's kind of hard to know. But many of the very colorful fishes will have these sort of displays that can be used as sexual signals. And so the wetland plants competing with each other, and we have two species of typha, and we have them at depth early in the season in May, and then late in the season. And the bars just have the total biomass. And we see at both times of the year, we get a situation where the one species is specialized to be in the shallow depths, and the other species is specialized to be in the deep depths. You may not you know, again, this is not an experimental thing. What experiment would you do to prove that this was an actual effect of competition? How would you test this?
Remove one species and see if the other goes ahead.
Sure, that'd be a good one. Or what's another way to do it? What's the other way around? Remove one species would be a good way. I mean, if the other thing you can do is you can do species additions, right? So you can take some of these and plant them up here and see if they could make it or if they got knocked out again. Probably, when you're only talking about this many centimeters, it's not an inability for a plant to get one place or another, but that would be the alternative. Now say just go in a whole wetland and rip out all of one species would be one way to do it. And then you want to replicate it as well. And we can talk about niche partitioning, and these are two rotifers, and the same kind of things we talked about when we talked about the prozoa earlier. They're, these rotifers are specializing on different particle size, particle concentrations, not size though. Right, so this one can maintain high growth rates. It's probably not real efficient at feeding, but if there's really high concentrations of food, it can do really well. Whereas this one would be more specialized for an oligotrophic environment, low concentrations of food. Again, we get these situations where there's these trade-offs, so you have to either specialize in one thing or another. Another way of looking at it is jack of all trades is a master of none. That mostly, if you adapt to do one thing in the natural world, that means you're precluding your ability to do the other. Whether it's talking about taking up light, whether it's talking about taking up nutrients, whether it's talking about eating different sizes of food or different concentrations of food. So these are all the different axes that you think about in a niche, and that's what they're talking about, the stage for the evolutionary play, right? Where the organisms